the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, sentient sea monkeys found in the extrasolar underwater broccoli forest of Gliese 581c, and then lost because they're so tiny. Bestest of the best, strangest of the strange, and an oil to fix squeaky egregiousness. Plus, we continue our complete audiobook serialization of David Drake's The Sea Without a Shore. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen editor Tony Daniel. This time on the podcast, we have a great discussion with the editor and a good many of the authors from this year's anthology, The Year's Best Military and Adventure SF 2015. Baen Consulting Editor David Afsharirad co-hosts the interview with me. David is also the editor of this very fine collection of stories, which he gathers from near and far. The story authors we talk to are Brendan Dubois, Andrea M. Pauley, Seth Dickinson, Claudine Griggs, Brian Dolton, and Hank Davis. We also want to remind you that until August, readers of the year's Best Military and Adventure SF 2015 can vote for the best story in the anthology, and the author of the winning story will receive $500 in a plaque at this year's DragonCon 2016. So reward the author of your favorite story in the book with some extra largesse and bling bling. The voting is vetted and we think very fair and just and fun. Details on how to vote are in the book. They're in the front matter. Plus, we continue our complete audiobook serialization of David Drake's The Sea Without a Shore. That's all coming up. Here's the news. We have new e-arcs available exclusively at the Baen eBooks retail site. Now, an e-arc is both the mating call of the alligator snapping turtle as it approaches the upper ranges of its ecstatic underwater vocalization, and it is also the call of distress made by the male snapping turtle after the female of the species bites his tail off after the two turtle up. No, that is totally bogus made-up stuff, we hope. No, an e-arc is an electronic advanced reading copy. This is an e-book that we sell before the proofreading and print production, and it used to be called the galley proof back in the days, when alligator snapping turtles gazed up through the asteroid ash and proclaimed, "We will survive this little setback." The main greatness of the e-arc is that you get the work of your favorite author, or of a writer who might become your favorite author, months before it comes out. This is especially neato if you like a particular series, such as out now is Project Elf Home e-arc by Win Spencer. This is a collection of 3 novellas all set in the Elf Home Tinker universe of the elves, Pittsburgh, and the transformed area where the two meet called Elf Home. Win has once again produced a wonderful book, and this one's got some really great tales in it. Some harrowing tales, too. Also out now in e-arc form is The Span of Empire by Eric Flint and David Carrico. This is a continuation of Eric's Zhao Empire series. This is science fiction detailing humanity's fight and alliance with the wily Zhao and just plain fight with the vile Eckhart. These are loosely based on the history of the 7 Years' War, I think. Eric started the series with Katie Wentworth, who passed away a few years ago, and now he and David Carrico, author of 1635, The Devil's Opera, both of them co-authors, by the way, are continuing the Zhao Empire series with The Span of Empire. Project Elf Home and The Span of Empire e-arcs are now available at baenebooks.com. I want to welcome the editor and several authors from the year's Best Military and Adventure SF 2015. This is a second edition of our wonderful anthology of year's best short stories as gleaned from many venues, magazines, print,
and online. Hi, everyone.
Hey, Tony. Hello.
We have the editor is David Afsharirad, who anyone who's been listening to the podcast for long will recognize as the guy I always get to do the short story anthology podcasts because he has to read them anyway because of his capacity as editor of this thing. David Afsharirad is the editor of the anthology series, The Year's Best Military and Adventure Science Fiction. You can also, like I said, hear him from time to time here at the Baen Free Radio Hour. His short stories have appeared in various places around the internet and in print, including in the upcoming Baen anthology, Things from Outer Space, edited by Hank Davis, who's also here with us, in which he appears sandwiched between H.P. Lovecraft and Robert Silverberg, which means your story is under a lot of pressure, I guess, or perhaps in the best of company, David.
Yeah. Never did I think I would be appearing between those two guys. So thank you to Hank for inviting me to submit something and then for liking the story. And thanks to you, Tony, for having us on today to talk about Year's Best Military and Adventure SF.
Sure. I would like to add, of course, that you're my former student from University of Texas at Dallas.
Yes, we've mentioned this a few times. Yeah. I am a Tony Daniel protege.
That's right, and both undergrad and graduate. And then we kicked him over to get his MFA at NC State. So yeah. He's well credentialed and has the best of mentors. David does.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, all right, David. Well, tell us a little bit about the general theme of the anthology and what your methodology is.
Okay, sure. So you said this is the second year we've done this. The first one had a slightly different title, which was Year's Best Military Science Fiction and Space Opera. But when I was talking with Baen publisher, Tony Weiskopf, I said, how strict do we want to be with those definitions? And she said, we'd rather have great stories that, fit the feel rather than being really strictly hewing to space opera or military definition. And so we kind of stretched it a little bit. And so for this year, we decided let's go ahead and change the title to Military and Adventure SF, and that'll let us do a little bit more, be a little bit more accurate with what we're doing. And the thing about these is, of course, there's quite a few, something like 19 Year's Best anthologies, and they all sort of have their own slants to some degree, but we wanted to do one that was the kind of, what it says, military and adventure, that would focus in on these sort of very edge-of-your-seat, plot-driven is a dirty word, I know, in some circles, but plot-driven...
story-rich, I believe.
Story-rich. Is that the way we like to put it? Yeah, story-rich, edge-of-your-seat, exciting stories that explored these sort of themes of adventure and space travel and exploration and that sort of thing. So that's the idea behind it. And how do I go about this? I read a lot of stories. I try to get my hands on everything I can. So I'll read the big online magazines, Clark's World and Lightspeed and Mike Resnick's Galaxy's Edge. And then, of course, the print, the big three print, FNSF, Fantasy and Science Fiction, and Analog and Asimov's. And then there are other things like Interzone and, so many venues out there. And, of course, then there's a lot of original anthologies that are happening now, many of them through Kickstarter. Like, there's not a story in here from it, but I really enjoyed it with Alex Schwartzman's Unidentified Funny Objects. I think they're going to do the 5th one this year. And Baen, of course, puts out some original anthologies such as Onward Drake, we've got 2 stories from that one. And then you've got other people do this, things like Kickstarter. I guess I mentioned that already. And then, of course, Thor and other publishers do put out anthologies, and I try to get my hands on those and read through them. And the nice thing about having this be themed is that I don't have to read everything. I can peruse a story and see, if it's fantasy, I might read it for my own enjoyment later, but I don't have to worry about it for this book. If it's not something that would be military or adventure SF, I can, read a few pages and realize this isn't the kind of thing we're looking for, and I can put it aside. And again, and I do this often, come back to read it for fun, but not for this particular book.
Well, tell us, David, about the twist on this book. We do something that a lot of the Year's Best don't do, which is our voting system.
Yeah, so this was something that maybe you came up with. I don't remember who it was, but we thought, why not tie this into because Baen has a great history, and one thing I love about Baen of involving their readers in the, I don't want to say in the production process, but involving the readers with the publishing house. And we thought this would be a neat way to do that, and that is we have the Year's Best Military and Adventure Science Fiction Reader's Choice Award. So you may be familiar with the Ann Lab Reader's Poll or the Asimov's Reader's Poll. This is like that for our anthology. So we've got an award which we handed out last year, and we'll do it again this year and presumably on into the future. And it's a plaque, a handsome plaque, and then an even handsomer stack of $100 bills, $500 to the winner. And readers get to vote. So the table of contents from the book is the ballot. And you can log on to, I'll say this slowly, www.baen.com/Year's Best Award 2015. And there'll be a little check mark box thing for each of the stories, and you can vote on your favorite. And you've got until the end of August to do that. And then we will tally up the votes, and we will hand out the award at DragonCon over Labor Day in Atlanta. And as I said, it's a plaque and $500. And so this is just a fun way to, reward writers. We like to put money and accolades into writers' hands, and also to involve the readers and make them feel like they get a say, because they do. They get a say in what is the year's best.
Yeah. So one of these writers might very well be $500 richer in August.
Yeah, well, 1st of September, yeah.
1st of September. Well, you have to wait on the boat till then, Brendan.
Yeah.
Or whomever. So.
Yeah, last year was the first year we did the anthology, and the first year we did the award. And Michael Z. Williamson won for a story, Soft Casualty, which is set in his Freehold universe.
Yeah, that was a great story.
Good turnout. Yeah, and it was a great turnout. We got I don't know, I don't have the numbers, but we were pleased with how many people got on board and voted, and we'd like to obviously continue that because the more people that vote, the
hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was not in the double digits. It was much higher than that. So, yeah.
So, David, go ahead and let's talk about the anthology. However you would like to proceed.
We're going to go in alphabetical order because that is the order they were in the back of the book. So, we have got Hank Davis here today. As we mentioned, he is senior editor at Baen Books. He is also a writer, obviously. His stories have appeared in Analog, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and the Orbit Anthology series, among other places. As an editor, he has edited several popular anthologies, which we have talked about many of them here on the podcast. Things like the Baen Big Book of Monsters, A Cosmic Christmas, and its sequel, A Cosmic Christmas to You, In Space No One Can Hear You Scream, Future Wars, and Other Punchlines, and Worst Contact. His story here today in the book is The Trouble with Telepaths, that originally appeared in Onward Drake. We actually talked, I think, about that story back when that book came out, but we wanted to talk to him again, and he agreed. So, Hank, thanks for being on again today.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure.
We hope so.
I feel the other participants outright me, but proceed.
Well, you, like me, had the benefit of alphabetically coming first, so don't underestimate that. All right. So we also have Seth Dickinson here. He is the author of the epic fantasy The Traitor Baru Cormorant and 16 short stories. He wrote much of the lore for Bungie Studios' Destiny He teaches at the Alpha Workshop for Young Writers. This is his second appearance in our Year's Best anthology. He was in the first volume with a story called Morrigan in the Sun Glare, which is related, unsurprisingly, to his story in this volume. That one is called Morrigan in Shadow. Seth, so glad you could be with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We also have Brian Dolton with us today. He has ridden a camel in the Sahara, played volleyball on a sandbar in the Pacific Ocean, stayed in a Zen Buddhist monastery on a sacred mountain in Japan. His story in here was, it's a far future mystery. I think that's a fair way to describe it. That appeared in fantasy and science fiction. We are happy to have him. Brian, thank you.
You're welcome. I should be identifiable on this as the only British voice, as far as I know, on the podcast.
Yeah, you will stand out, yes. We also have Brendan Dubois here with us on the line. He is the award-winning author of 19 novels and more than 150 short stories. His stories have twice won him the Shamus Award for the Private Eye Writers of America and have also earned him 3 Edgar Award nominations. He is a former Jeopardy champion, and he recently appeared on and won the game show The Chase. His first science fiction novel, Dark Victory, was published back in January from Baen, and he is working on a sequel, or maybe the sequel is done, and Tony is working on editing it. I'm not sure. Either way, his story,
it's on my desk.
The Siege of Denver, is set in that same world, and he kicks off the anthology. He's the first story in there after my little preface and David Weber's introduction. Brendan, thanks for being on.
Well, David and Tony, thanks for letting me come play in the science fiction universe after so many years in the mystery and thriller field. It's great to be here.
All right. We also have Claudine Griggs. She is the Writing Center Director at Rhode Island College, and her publications include 3 nonfiction books about transsexuals, along with a couple dozen articles on writing, teaching, and other topics. She also just recently began writing fiction, and she's published 3 stories, one of which appears in the book, of course, and she hopes to write more science fiction, which was her first love genre as a teenager. She earned her BA and MA in English at California State Polytechnic University in Pomona, and she is also a Vietnam-era veteran, I believe the Air Force. Claudine, thank you so much for calling in today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and say hello from Rhode Island.
You're just down the road from Brendan, right? He's in New Hampshire, so we've got a lot of you guys are on the East Coast. I may be the lone Texan here. Anyways, finally we have Andrea M. Pauley. She writes short stories, blogs for Waitlist Books, and writes occasional book reviews for the Washington Independent Review of Books. Her story, For the Love of Sylvia City, which is in Year's Best, was inspired by the work of oceanographer Dr. Sylvia Earle and a government publication with one of her favorite titles of all time. That title is The Shallow Water Benthic Habitats of the Main Hawaiian Islands, 2007. I'm guessing she'll tell us more about that today. Andrea, thank you so much for being on.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. Well, so we did that alphabetically. And since we aren't in the room to draw straws and see which one of you gets the short straw to go first, I'm going to just go kind of through the table of contents in order, which means, Brendan, you are up first. I wanted to ask you a couple things. One is that, as we mentioned, you have got quite the list of credentials in the mystery writing field. Now the name of your, hang on, let me see if I can remember it. Dead Sand was your first book, and the detective's name that I can't think of.
It's Lewis Cole, Lewis Cole Detective Series.
Yep, Lewis Cole, there we go. I should have written that. I had that so queued up. Anyways, I read that earlier this year, really enjoyed it. So you have been writing mysteries for quite a while, and as we mentioned, won the Shamus Award, been nominated for Edgars, but you're just now kind of starting to get into the science fiction field. You've had stories in Analog recently, I know, and of course these 2 novels from Baen in this story. So what's it like making that switch, although you're still writing mysteries, we should say, but what's it like making that switch, jumping from the mystery genre over to science fiction?
Actually, it's a lot of fun. My first love was science fiction and fantasy. I'm a child of the 60s and early 70s, back during the space race, and I read all the old greats, Asimov, Bradbury, Andrew Norton, the whole Heinlein, the whole schlemiel. And I really wanted to break into science fiction, but my first short stories are always rejected by the science fiction magazines. And almost by happenstance, I sold one to Ellery Queen's Mr. Magazine, and that sort of set my path for the next 20 or so years. But I always had a fondness for science fiction, and I was just thrilled when Baen picked up a science fiction novel I just wrote just for the fun of it, just for the pure fun of it. And it's great being reacquainted, though I have to say, with all due respect, the genre of mystery and thrillers where people are killing each other and slitting throats actually are very pleasant people to meet with, and it's everybody seems to get along. And now I'm finding that the science fiction and fantasy field, which should be sort of a forward-looking, we're all in this together as humanity field, boy, there's turf battles and tongue wars going back decades I'm just getting familiar with. But I guess that helps me if I'm deciding to write military science fiction.
Right, there's maybe some ready-made conflict there for you. Well, so
Absolutely.
you are writing some military science fiction. This story is certainly that, and it is set in the world of Dark Victory and the sequel. There's a great little twist at the end here that I hesitate. I don't want to give away, but a little surprise. But why don't you tell us, if you can, a little bit about the world that Siege of Denver is set in, and also then, of course, the Dark Victory and its sequel is set in as well.
Sure. I decided to have fun writing an alien invasion novel, which, of course, is one of the classic plots of science fiction. But I decided to play a little bit different. A lot of those novels and short stories that deal with alien invasion, the alien invasion happens on page 1, paragraph 1, or sentence 1. And I took it a little differently. I placed it 10 years after they came and started raising a ruckus, figuring we'll just jump right into a world, an Earth, which is actually concurrent to today. I had the aliens coming within the next decade or so. So everything's familiar. But the way the aliens attacked pretty much disabled our 21st century technology. So you're having basically an interstellar war on Earth being fought with 19th century technology. There's steamships, telegraphs, coal-powered locomotives. And so it really gets down to the nitty-gritty as how far will humanity go to fight the invader. And the twist is, let's just say the women and men who are fighting the war are not quite what you would expect them to be. How's that for being a little bit
I think that's
mysterious?
Yes, mysterious and enticing without giving away too much. Yeah, and in this story, they're using older technology. In this, it is the city of Denver is besieged by these aliens,
aliens, right?
Yeah, and our intrepid heroes are well, they're not, but we're trying to get supplies to them via hot air balloon, correct? And
19th century technology.
Right, and so they are making an effort to make sure that happens, and it gets kind of hairy for a while there, and you will have to read it to see if they are successful or not, everybody.
The thing that I love about Brendan's world with Dark Victory and with this story is that he doesn't, the aliens, we don't know what the hell they're doing or why they are. He probably knows himself, but it's the way I imagine a real invasion might go. It's like, it's almost incomprehensible, some of the moves they make.
Exactly. And as my characters say to one another, what do you expect? They're aliens. We don't know what is driving them. And that's the mystery in both books and the short story is, why are they here and why are they doing what they're doing? And at some point, Tony will probably put a knife to my throat and tell me to reveal all, but hopefully that might be a book or two down the road. We'll see.
We know a little bit at least now.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So I'll just let you guys plug it. When is the sequel coming out? Do we know, or is it still in the works?
It's
Tony D right now.
Yeah, it's on my desk. It's spring, but the mass market of Dark Victory will be out in August. The first novel in the series.
The Siege of Denver, pick up the mass market or the trade paperback of the book. So, all right. Well, let me just move down the table of contents then, because we were lucky enough to have so many people on, but that means we got to go kind of fast, unfortunately. To Andrea's story, For the Love of Sylvia City. This is one that takes place underwater, and Tony and I were discussing what are we going to talk about earlier today. And we were thinking that, you saw a lot of these, I was mentioning childhoods they have underwater cities. This was Tony, what was the show you mentioned,
I
Tony?
mentioned Sea Lab 2020 from the cartoons. That's my touchstone for an underwater.
So there seemed like there was a lot of them. And
yeah, it was like a 70s
much anymore.
Motif.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess you mentioned you were inspired by a certain work, and I just wondered. It was great to see an underwater story in 2015. You don't see those much, is what I'm getting at. So maybe you could just tell us about where you got that idea from and how the story came about a little bit. So.
Yeah, sure. I have a tendency to be interested in how big structures work, like big infrastructure. I don't know why. Like, I do. I work for the government, and it's really weird. Like, all my stories seem to be about, like, how does this system work? Anyway, every day at work would walk past this report with this beautiful, shining cover, like, well, from paper or whatever, because it's the government. We can't get anything published in hardback, but it was this beautiful, like, someone had put a lot of effort into this, and it was the shallow water benthic habitats of the main Hawaiian islands, and I'm like, that is so specific. Like, years have gone into this, right? And so anyway, and that's something that I love is, like, when you do research, I'm not a scientist, but scientists, they have to be so specific, and they're all really, in reality, working together, even though it might not be true, like, on the surface. They're working together to advance scientific knowledge, and they're all mostly doing these tiny little things. And at the same time, for a year walking past this report that I saw many times every day, and I was totally fascinated by without cracking it open early on, I also somewhere, like, realized the bottom of the ocean is like, it has cables on it, not just they connect the internet now, like, that's how the internet works, by these giant, not large anymore, but these cables that connect us with, in the United States, we're connected to Europe and South America, and suddenly, like, a Caribbean country gets a cable, and suddenly they have fantastic internet service. And that whole system is based on telegraph cables, the first ones that were laid in the 1850s. And so, anyway, one thing led to another, and I wanted to write, like, an underwater story, and I had put it in Sylvia City, the title, but that just didn't quite seem where the story was. And when something is underwater, especially if it's in, like, a transitional area, like on the continental shelf, you have this kind of a constant change, and I wanted a character that was also having, in some kind of, like, indeterminate state of change. And in the story, my main character is the last refugee from the land going down to Sylvia City with her parents at some point, and she's since grown up, and one day she doesn't feel like she belongs anywhere. She definitely doesn't belong on the land, and there's this haven on the bottom of the ocean, and she's doing her, basically, service, not quite military service, maintaining undersea cables kind of on the continental shelf, and she has some physical aspects that make her best suited to work on the continental shelf as opposed to people who might have grown up in Sylvia City. And one day she has to make a decision about which world she's going to be part of, the underwater world or the one above. And so, anyway, seriously, telegraph cables on the bottom of the ocean being laid in the 1850s. Seriously. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So we're kind of like Brendan. Yeah, sure, kind of like Brendan's story. We are talking about old technology, although this is a very different story than his. But yeah, so and the cables play an important role. Maybe that doesn't come in till she's maintaining them, and then something happens and something changes. Maybe I shouldn't say.
Yeah, and it's a modern story. I mean, it's not set in the 1850s,
right,
but
right.
it's
yeah, we
still
should
there's all this. and what's going to happen with all this infrastructure as time goes on? Like, we have all these things buried in the ground underneath us. I live in Washington, D.C. We have metro tunnels everywhere. What happens to those in the future? Are they really going to take them down when we're all in hovercraft? I don't know. What's going to happen? Kind of cool.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, so your main character needs breathing apparatus, but most of the people that live in Sylvia City, they're sea adapted, right?
That's right. So I had to think about what kind of breathing apparatus the main character would have, and among other things. And I tried to design things that could be realistic about a breathing apparatus that is somewhat alive still, or in another case, an underwater vessel. It's like a personal underwater vessel that's also alive to a certain extent. So the particular breathing apparatus has layers on it that peel off. They kind of grow and peel off, and they're on her underwater, the suit that she lives in, and it's kind of like they're not quite in symbiosis with her, but it's a living thing, and it protects her away from pressure contortions underwater. And anyway.
And what is the conflict that's going on the land, and why is Sylvia City a refuge?
The conflict is there was a war, and I called it a carbon war, and it's a war that targets carbon-based life forms. And as a result of the war that had previously happened, 20 years before or something like that, there was a lot of pollution in the air because it's basically burning carbons as gigantic weapons that have killed a lot of people and have also changed the environment of the Earth to a certain extent. And, all this stuff we know about, like, what happened, the potential for the ocean to be like a carbon sink, and how carbonic acid may not be the right one, but the fallout, carbon fallout going into the ocean has affected, the ocean, the Earth, the land, and people are still trying to survive on the land. And on the day that the main character has to make a decision, the carbon war has flared up again. And this is very bad because the only refuge is on the bottom of the ocean.
This strikes me as it's a really rich world, and it kind of strikes me that you might have a novel here. Are you working on one based on this story?
That is a terrifying idea, but yes, it has crossed my mind. It has crossed my mind,
Leave it at that, baby.
Yeah.
That's one thing I love about science fiction, and I'm looking ahead at folks we're going to talk to and the other folks who we would have loved to have on, but like I said, we only have so much time. So your story is like 14 pages in this book, and all of that you get all of this that you're saying layered in there. Brendan's story, you get all this background and this very rich world, and Seth's, and everybody's coming up that we'll talk about. It's just a comment. I guess I don't have anything to say more than that. It's one of the things that draws me to science fiction is all this neat background stuff that sort of just barely shows in the stories, but that it's there. So,
yeah. Synecdoche. I thought I taught you that word, David.
I was just
letting the part represent the whole. It's the secret weapon of short stories.
Yeah. Well, yes. And especially science fiction short stories.
Absolutely.
Let's keep on trucking here. So the next story that we have the contributor on is Claudine Griggs' A Helping Hand. And this one's short, but I really wanted to have you on, Claudine, because I liked it so much.
It was also one of Tony Weisskopf's favorites.
Yeah, she really liked that. She gave that a big thumbs up. So but we wanted to have you on, even though it's going to be hard to talk about without just saying what it's about. But this one appeared in Lightspeed, and I think in Lightspeed's one of their special issues. But it felt like it could have been, and I mean this as a high praise, not big on Lightspeed, which I enjoy as well. But it felt like it could have been an analog story in a way. It's very hard science, character solving a problem in a no-nonsense sort of way. So that's what I liked about it, personally. So, I don't know, Tony, did you have any questions?
Well, could she set up the problem, and then we'll let the readers speculate, the listeners speculate on how Claudine solves it. If you would, Claudine.
Yes. I like strong women, and when I thought of the story, I just said I want to write about a woman who's in a situation and she knows she's going to die. And in the first draft, as I was working on it, I thought she would die. So I set up the situation where she's in space and sort of trapped, floating between her shuttle and a satellite, and she just accepts that cold reality. But she really was a strong woman. I often think, well, she's the kind of woman I want to be. And she starts thinking, and she fought her way out of it in a way that surprised me. But it was really going to be about the character and the situation, and I did want it to make it as hard as possible, as I'm capable of. Even as an English major, I try to study astronomy, and I did go to the Launchpad workshop in 2013. And so I thought I had some good ideas about what space might be like. I also think in the future space travel is just going to be routine, and we will be working there, living there, and just like problems that happen on Earth in our work environment or our recreational environments, they will happen in space. So I set up the problem, and Alexandria surprised me, and I really admired her for that. But I think I also disclose in the story something about her understanding of what death was, and that she really did not want to die, and that she worried about it, even though she certainly is that strong woman. So that was where, and I like concise, brief writing. I also started into the story with that in mind. I wanted it to be very concise. I mean, I like brief writing almost as much as a double cheeseburger. So I wanted the story to be short, and it's nice that you said it could have appeared in analog. I hadn't sent it to analog, but it had been rejected twice before it was drafted, although I came up with that title toward the end. My working title was Stranded, and then I changed it to Newton's Law, and then finally, I think in the 9th draft, I came up with the title Helping Hand, and I was very pleased, obviously, when Lightspeed accepted it. I thought it was a good story, and I'm glad.
It was, she's in a terrifying position, which just thinking of, it's kind of like the space version of being buried alive. You're spinning around, and you're not far from safe haven, but you just can't grab anything, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's why I said, oh, well, this will be a story about a woman who dies in space. So again, in the process of drafting, I've often discovered that my characters find solutions that I hadn't imagined when I started writing it, or the solution I thought was going to happen doesn't turn out quite that way. So it was a fun story, and I wish I could be like that, and I wish I could be an astronaut and do all those sorts of things and never lose my cool, even when facing, as she believes, certain death in the beginning. But unfortunately, I'm not as adventurous as that, at least not in my office here at Rhode Island College.
Yeah, the first line is, Alexandria Stevens knew she was going to die a slow, cold death in space, which is quite a hook. I mean, that drew me in. And then, yeah, I know I mentioned him before on here, but Joe Hill, the Stephen King son, and the novelist in his own right, his first novel was like this. He thought he was going to write a short story about a guy who bought a ghost on eBay, haunted something on eBay, and the ghost was going to kill him, and then he gets a novel out of it because the main characters wouldn't die. And so, yeah, this is a similar thing of the character taking you place you didn't expect. So that's very interesting to hear that that's how that came about. So
she was tougher than I expected. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was rooting for her, so I'm glad she made it. And of course, movies like Gravity come to mind.
Well, it's I mean, it has echoes. I don't know if it's intentional of the Cold Equations, that famous story.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
By Hank. What the heck is the author's name? Tom Godwin.
Godwin. There we go. I just wanted to interject. This is Andrea. I really enjoyed the humor in Claudine's story too. Like the kind of spunky humor was just kind of fantastic. Like the accepting, and it was wonderful. It was a great read.
Thank you.
Right, and like I said, unfortunately, we got to keep moving on. I'm going to have to be the taskmaster here, but let's move down now to another great read. Of course, I think they're all great reads. Otherwise, they probably would not be in here. And that is Morrigan in Shadow by Mr. Seth Dickinson. As I mentioned, I guess a prequel. It's a prequel. It takes place before, called Morrigan in the Sun Glare. Was in last year's book, and when I saw they were both in Clark's World originally. When I saw Morrigan in Shadow pop up, I thought, ooh. So here we are. And so this is the same characters. If you read the first anthology, or if you read it on Clark's World, so Morrigan in the Sun Glare, we are back now with Morrigan in Shadow. And when I was writing, I get to one of the fun things you get to do is write those little intro blurbs. And when I was writing this, we talk about synecdoche and packing a lot in. I was like, how the heck am I going to put all this in a little one-paragraph blurb? I think I did a great job. But,
yeah.
Geez, where do we start, Seth? So this, maybe you give us the setup as best as you can, realizing we only have like an hour tops for this whole thing. So,
it's a very dense story with a really weird structure, but it's pretty simple at the core. It's about a woman, a soldier, who's torn between what she has to do to complete her mission and her kind of human obligation to her lover. And it's about how far you're willing to go to win. And the sort of conflict between the ends justify the means and right. And that grows into this sort of huge cosmological science fiction idea. But that's the kernel of it all, the emotional engine.
Yeah,
there's a lot of... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say there's a lot of interesting trivia behind this story, but we can get to that.
Yeah, for sure. We can. Well, give us some while we're here.
While I'm excusing you. So this story is actually based on a game mod that myself and some colleagues, people I know through the internet, made for this ancient game called Free Space 2 from 1999. I'm sorry, that's ancient in my life. And we got the source code to it, and we were able to sort of create our own stories in the game. And you can actually play through all the events of Morrigan in the Sun Glare and most of Morrigan in Shadow online, or you can see other people playing them if you don't want to actually buy the game. You can look it up on YouTube. It's called Blue Planet. And Morrigan in Shadow actually kind of leaps over the game's progress. So for the fans, the people who've been sticking with us for all these years, trying to figure out what would happen next, it was kind of a cool chance to see how the story might go.
Yeah, wow, that's fascinating. So I was going to ask you if there was like a novel in this, but it sounds like there already is. Maybe there is still, but there's already a bigger structure that this fits into.
Well, you talked about how it's a strangely structured story. It does have you're addressing the reader in some portions of the story. You're saying I'm telling a story. Why did you choose to tell the story that way? What was the I mean, maybe you don't know. Maybe it just came to you, Seth.
Yeah, I tried to make the story linear in its emotional logic, but it's all mixed up chronologically, and I was really worried that would get too confusing to follow. So I tried to. I was thinking about the way that a lot of news sites now will actually give you a little progress bar as you scroll through the article. And I think this probably compels readers to read a little more because there's a sense of satisfaction, and you fill up the bar. It's like progress. It's a reward. So I tried using the headings of the different threads to clue readers in as to where they were in the story and how much progress they'd made on that thread. And then towards the end, I was able to use those headings in a metafictional way, to sort of start messing with the structure of the story to reflect the mindfuckery going on within it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sure. What is the? Go ahead, David, if you want to.
No, you go.
Follow up. Well, what is the? So the setup is that we have humans fighting humans, but there's a lurking menace. What is the situation as the story begins, as far as the strategic? Where are we with humans in space?
Yeah, it's a conflict between two good guys, two rival democracies with different conceptions of what's necessary for human survival. So there's the Federation, which lives around Earth, and it's sort of utopian. They've really worked on conditioning their citizens to be better people, building a state where people can be everything that they have the potential to be. But the problem is they've been isolated for a long time. There was a cataclysm that sort of broke the wormhole that connected Earth to the rest of their colonies. And the colonists, the Alliance, have been stuck out there trying to hold off these really, really very alien aliens.
They're not even sentient, right?
Yes,
that's kind of their strength.
Yeah, they were sort of an attempt to figure out how you would fight against enemies much, much smarter than human beings. And to me, the answer was, if you can't outsmart them, you have to devalue sort of awareness and intelligence as useful traits in winning the war. So the Colonist Alliance has been facing these guys, and eventually what they do is they rebuild the wormhole back to Earth, and they say, hey, can you guys help us out? And they want to mobilize Earth into a war economy because, they need to survive, and Earth has a ton of resources. I know anyone listening will probably wonder, why would anyone with access to that much, real estate out there need resources from Earth? And it has to do with how industrialized Earth is and where the population is distributed. The problem is, of course, that the people, the Federation, aren't willing to try to wreck their civilization to go to a war footing. They think there has to be another solution. So the colonists end up saying, if you're not willing to help us fight these aliens, we're going to have to incorporate you by force. And that's where the conflict comes from. And when this story starts, the Federation is basically lost. And part of the reason it's lost is that its citizens are psychologically unprepared to commit acts of mass violence, which is a great thing, I think, but unfortunately made it tough for them to fight the war.
Right. It's not maybe it's a great thing, and maybe not in this circumstance. And that was one of the things that was fascinating to me. Is you got a very alien, which I always like. I mean, I like guys in rubber suits too, but a very alien, and then two factions of humans and all three think so differently from each other. And that was one of the really interesting things to me about it.
It also, I mean, it follows. It's the kind of it has the kind of theme that David Drake explores a lot, which is that the warrior has to become something that is somewhat monstrous to his or her own culture in order to be effective, right? So,
yeah, absolutely, and they've institutionalized this in the story with this group they call Nagari, which is sort of where they stick everyone who's not psychologically suited to live in utopia. And these people are basically sort of weaponized monsters who serve as a sort of method of last resort for protecting the Federation.
but she's a very sympathetic weaponized monster.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm glad.
Did you have any?
For sure.
There was a lot of. I had the feeling of a great Greg Bear novella called Hard Fought. Did that have any influence here?
Yes, Tony, I knew you. I thought of that, and I thought of you, and I read it. So.
I've read and loved Greg Bear. I haven't read that one.
Yeah.
What?
Check it out. Hard Fought. It is Tony. We talked about Tony was my old teacher. That was one he assigned in class, and I think, and I hope you take this as a compliment. I don't mean it to be anything but Hard Fought in this, both, they're incredibly rewarding, but you're going to have to put some effort in, and that's what I tell people when people ask me, friends who I have who aren't readers necessarily, but they're being nice and they bought the book I edited. I say, read them all. I said, Morgan and Shadow, you might have to put a little effort, but do it. You're going to be glad you made it through. So, yeah. So, well, we could talk about this on and on and on. Let me ask you one last thing. Are you going to do a novel? Are you going to write more stories in this, or are we done with Morgan and crew?
So my hope is that we'll be able to wrap up the game series eventually, but it takes so much work. I'm not sure when we'll be able to get to it. So I might end up doing more short stories in the world. The problem is that the game actually has a more complex setting with a couple extra alien species with their own sort of cognitive architectures. And I chopped them out of the Morrigan stories for simplicity. And to continue the story past where we are, I feel like I'd have to bring them back in. So I feel like, Morrigan's character arc, Naomi Laporte in the story is at a pretty good place. She got her happy ending. Yeah. And I'm also in contract with Tor to write some novels for them. And one thing I have thought about a lot and worried about a lot is that, for me, Morgan and Shadow was a really self-indulgent story. It was, I really liked just sitting down and writing all this crazy stuff about radically alien aliens and space fighters dogfighting. And I do worry that when I let myself go like that, I end up producing work that takes, we'll put it kindly and say, takes a lot of effort to get something out of. So I've been thinking a lot about how to streamline.
Okay, all right.
But yeah.
Well, we'll keep an eye out. Yeah. All right. Like I say, I gotta cut you off. I want to say thanks to Hank and Brian for hanging in there. We will get to you guys. We'll get to Hank now, and then Brian. I appreciate you so much. We're gonna end with a bang with you, but first let's go to Hank Davis. Hank, we talked about this story once. It is in Onward Drake, which was Mark Van Name edited book in honor of David Drake, who listeners will, I'm sure, be familiar with. And this is a story you have known Dave Drake, who, by the way, is also in the anthology we'll talk about. Me and Tony may talk about his story here in a minute. But you've known him for years, and you said when we talked last time that you kind of crafted this story, you guys are good friends, by kind of thinking to yourself, what do me and David Drake both like as far as science fiction and that goes? So maybe just talk about some of the elements that you brought into your story. It's called The Trouble with Telepaths.
Yeah. Since it was going to be in honor of David Drake, I figured that it had to involve military personnel. And fortunately or unfortunately, since I was in the 101st Airborne in Vietnam, never jumped out of a plane, fortunately, I just had to draw memories, bad as it were. This is, although actually I didn't have any combat in it, it seems to be sort of a peacetime army, or at least stateside soldiers, who are in the future, but it's the army is still pretty much the army. Some of the technology has changed, and there's an addition that telepathy has been developed, and it's under sort of control. And there are a lot of officers who are telepaths. I assumed the telepath is generally not good for somebody if you're a telepath. So a lot of the officers aren't in very long. This is all sort of background. Basically, also wanted to have some other stuff. David is a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft, so I introduced a Lovecraftian element. And he's also a reader of Charles Fort, so I threw in some Charles Fort without actually saying so. Readers of Charles Fort will pick up on it. And anyway, Dave said he liked it, which was the main objective. And he also said something I hadn't even thought of, which was it was a very much like the stories he read in the 50s and 60s, which, come to think of it, it certainly is. There's nothing new wave about it. It's been written in the 50s or 60s. And also, telepathy plays a strong part. That was in a lot of stories in the 50s and 60s, but we don't see it that much anymore. One reason might be John Campbell is no longer around, and he was fascinated by psionics. And another reason might be that J.B. Wright himself is dead. And from what I understand, his department, or whatever it was called, at Duke University is pretty much non-functional now. No one is investigating telepathy. If telepathy is real, we probably will find out about it a long time in the future. Probably by accident. But, anyway, I pretty much wrote the story in first person. And I made the hero not a telepath. And I've got through invading secret aliens. Invading aliens are more fun if they're secret. And then I threw in a not very original ending. So I don't really know what else to say about the story. I'm a little amazed you picked it for the year's best, because I didn't think it was anything outstanding, but David Drake liked it. So it achieved its raison d'etre, if I'm pronouncing it right.
Yes, there are two Davids that liked it, I guess. So David Drake, at least two Davids that liked it, and me. And just as you're saying, Hank, I remember when I emailed you, I said, I want to put it in there, and Tony Daniel, who kind of acted as the Bane editor on this, and then Tony Weisskopf both liked it and said that I could, and you said, well, I guess I'm outvoted then. So we put it in here. I always like your stories, Hank, and I think what David Drake says is right. They give me, I grew up weirdly like out of time, not reading the things that were, because I grew up reading like Frederick Brown and Henry Kuttner and Bradbury and stuff, even though I was born in '83, like long after most of those guys were, well, Bradbury was still alive, I guess. But, and so they have that feel, but they don't feel like obnoxiously a throwback, right? They don't feel like you're doing something clever with being a throwback. They feel like, in the best possible way, they feel like something that could have been written in the 50s or 60s. And I agree, I like the telepath stuff because, again, we just never see it either because, for whatever reason. So. Tony, do you have anything to say about?
Well, the thing about Hank's stories is that they always seem to be straightforward in such a manner, but there's always a little modern subversion in there. Hank is so deeply read, and it feels rich with the past, but at the same time, there's always a little twist that lets you know it's present day or the future, or that it's a story from our time. So you're not that good at hiding your modern sensibilities, Hank.
The other thing I always like is the voice. You said this is in first person, and I think most of the stuff I've read of yours has been. And certainly if you guys have ever read a Hank edited anthology, his intros are like this. The voice is always the narrator, and the narrator of his intros being him, I guess, you know. There's these fun asides and I don't know, just the tone, it's a very, I don't want to say jokey because that sounds bad. That sounds like I'm putting it down, but a very casual, like a friend telling you a story in the best possible way. And this has got that in there, although it's also pretty scary at points as well. Well, let's end with a bang. So, Brian Dolton, thanks so much for hanging in here with us, and we are now going to talk about This Is the Way the Universe Ends with a Bang, your short story that was in fantasy and science fiction originally, and then now towards the end of Year's Best. Tony, I obviously, again, love this story, but I know you were a big fan as well, and I knew you would be as I was reading this. Originally in my copy of FNSF, I thought Tony Daniel's going to dig this one. So do you want to, I'll turn it over to you for a second, if you want to talk to Brian, and I'll jump in.
I absolutely love the story, definitely, so thank you, Brian, for creating it. But the idea of a mystery story at the end of the universe is so freaking cool. Did you go into the story thinking that that's what you wanted to do, or did it just sort of arise from the writing of it?
I'm not really sure where the original idea for the end of the universe murder mystery came from. Who doesn't want to destroy the universe? Who doesn't want to, actually, if you're a science fiction writer, you want to destroy the universe. You're like, I've got that power. I'm going to just end everything. So there's, I had a few of these concepts existed before as background ideas for other stories that I've had. I was borrowing other pieces that already existed. But, I just wanted to see what happens if, there's only a few beings left at the end of the universe, and they don't necessarily all get on with each other. The story came from a few sort of other ideas that I had. Some of the concepts existed in, a science fiction universe and science fiction stories that I've drafted out, and I was just putting stuff together to see what I could do when I could, at the end of the universe. What do you do when the universe is dying and there's only a few beings left, and they have very different ideas about how to deal with the death of the universe and the inevitable death of everything.
And these are super beings. They're like what happened if the singularity popped up all over different places in the universe, something like that, right?
They're all completely different. They are mostly completely incomprehensible, so I don't go into any kind of physical descriptions or anything of the vast majority of them. There's some made-up words, there's some made-up concepts. There's a lot of borrowed from our current ideas on the abstruse corners of physics, but I can't pretend to understand all of the bits and pieces that get pulled in there.
It had a real, I don't know if it's an influence. I'm throwing out stories, but it felt like Brian Aldiss was an influence on you, particularly that great story of his, whose name is escaping me, the worm. I can't. Hank will know it, probably.
The one from Flies.
Yes.
There are little bits of influences from all over the place. Titles and lists, there are odd quotes and references here and there to all manner of stuff. Probably the most stuff was some of Steve Baxter's work out of maybe Vacuum Diagrams, which I think is a series of short his that all fall into the same timeline and universe as some of his novels as well. And I was interested in the feel of that. And it's possibly James Blish, which somebody commented on, I know when it was published in science fiction, The Cities in Flight, in the very end, the final scenes from Cities in Flight, which I read many, many, many years ago, and that is probably an influence there as well, just in terms of when the universe ends. How does it end, and what happens when that's going on? And
can you kind of set up what the situation in the story?
the situation is there's, I think when it starts, there are 92 beings left in the entire universe. And so they're all different. Some of them are effectively collective intelligences that are the remains of some race that existed long, long previously. Even I don't necessarily know who they are. They're totally different from one another. They are the only 92 beings left, and the universe is winding down. It's 99+% complete. They know that resources are scarce. Time is coming to an end. The universe is basically going to stop and die, and there will be nothing left. So they have formed into groups who each have a different philosophical approach to how to deal with that.
Yeah. Tell us about a couple of these super beings, because I found they're sort of like thematic, right?
To some extent, yes. There are philosophies taken to particular extremes in some cases. They are more about their ideas than any sort of physical form or structure. They're concepts. I mean, if there's one called Hapax Legomenon, which only ever to deal with introducing new concepts. So anything it tries to communicate, it's trying to say it has never been communicated through the entire history of the universe, which means it actually has to instruct the people it's talking to how to translate these concepts because it's doing such a new thing. So it's completely incomprehensible to everyone. When it's talking to you, it almost has to provide a dictionary with the statement that it's making so that you can understand what it's trying to say.
Yeah, it's just a super cool conception. Anything else, David?
Well, I just like to compliment these stories because it's kind of like complimenting myself for picking them, right? But I kind of hate gimmickiness, right? I'd rather people just tell a straightforward story. And so, like, when you see, like, what you're talking about, it's telling you to translate fonts and all this, I'm, like, worried, like, oh, this is going to be, and then, man, not at all. Like, this is such a wonderful story that instead, it never felt like a gimmick. It never felt overpowering. Again, maybe there were parts that were challenging, but it felt like you knew that it was going to be worth it if you, got through it. And they weren't really challenging. I mean, the thing to me is you're dealing with 92 sentient beings that are all different at the end of time, and yet I never got lost in the story. I never lost the thread. I always knew who was who. Even when I didn't, obviously you can't comprehend these beings, but you can't, let me put it this way, you couldn't comprehend the beings, but you could comprehend the story easily. And that was, to me, that's the neatest trick of this, is this packing all this world building and these far out concepts, and yet the story is, in many ways, a very straightforward mystery story. And again, that's not a question, that's just a comment on it. But that there you go, boom.
Incidentally, the James Blish novel about the end of the universe he mentioned is The Triumph of Time. I understand it's published in England as a clash of symbols, symbols being the musical instruments, not the things that English majors go on about.
That was the Cities in Flight quarto, right?
Yeah, that was the fourth volume of Cities in Flight. I think the sequence is They Shall Have Stars, which originally had a different title. Then Earthman Come Home. No, sorry. Then Earthman Come Home is the third one. I find I can't remember the second one, which was somewhat the weakest one since it was written as a juvenile, even if it was serialized at analog. And this is all irrelevant, so I will shut up.
Everyone should read the Spin Dizzy books. Well, David, do you want to sum up and say goodbye? Or do we have anything else we need to add here?
Why don't we do this? Why don't we cut these authors loose so they can go write stories for Year's Best 2016? and maybe me and you can talk about some of the other stories in there just briefly, and then we'll wrap it up. Does that sound good?
Yeah. Well, let's just want to thank everyone greatly for being with us and providing some insight into these wonderful stories that you've written.
Thanks for the invite.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
Take care,
everybody.
guys.
It's great talking with you.
Yeah,
All right.
Butch's granola, or whatever the word is.
Well, thanks, Tony, and it's a lot of fun. And I also want to say thanks to we had about half the contributors on just due to scheduling, and then of course, I mean this is a long interview as you can see, so we couldn't have everybody on. So I do want to just briefly mention David Drake, who's got a great story called "Save What You Can," which is the first Hammer Slammer story in like over a decade. When it was originally published, it was. Now it's been reprinted here. We've got one of my favorite writers, Joe Lansdale. He's got a kind of a Burroughs send-up called Wizard of the Trees. Sarah Pinsker wrote a really touching short military science fiction, after the war is over, called Remembery Day. We got Brad Torgerson as back again. He was in the first volume. He's got a story called Gyre, which is set in this larger Sargasso universe, Sargasso containment universe, which you can read about online. Eric Leaf Davin, who was also in the first one, he's back again with a story called Twilight on Olympus. And finally, we got David Brin, who wrote a story called Tumble Downs of Cleopatra Abyss, which has got a lot of good attention, including closing out year's best military and adventure science fiction 2015. So, anyways, those are all worthy stories. I would love to have those people on as well, but we just didn't have time. So thank you to them. Thank you to the people who are on, and thank you, Tony.
And let's one more time mention the place you can vote.
Yes, go vote. Vote early and often. Actually, I think you can just vote once. But
Yeah, it's proctored.
And it is absolutely. We've got it set up to where it can't be fiddled with, and it's www.bain.com/Year's Best Award 2015. And so go buy the anthology, read it, make the agonizing decision of which one is your favorite, and vote for it, and we will hand out the award at DragonCon.
Now we continue with our complete audiobook serialization of David Drake's The Sea Without a Shore. It seems Cinnabar's chief spy master is a mother also, and her son is determined to search for treasure in the midst of a civil war. Who better to hold the boy's hand and to take the blows directed at him than Captain Daniel Leary, the Republic of Cinnabar Navy's troubleshooter, and his friend the cyber spy Adele Mundy. The only thing certain in the struggle for control of the mining planet Corsaira is that the rival parties are more dangerous to their own allies than to their opponents. Daniel and Adele face kidnappers, pirates, and a death squad even before they can get to the real business of ending the war on Corsaira and bringing their charge home, maybe along with ancient alien treasure. Now here is the next entry of David Drake's The Sea Without a Shore.
Chapter 2. Bantry Estate, Cinnabar. The run back to Bantry village was long and tedious at the best speed the skiff could manage, but Daniel found that he didn't care. He sat, more comatose than relaxed, in the bow while Hogg held the tiller. Not that much guidance was required. "That was too bloody close," Hogg said harshly. He didn't need to detail what he was thinking of. Even this close to shore on a calm day, the skiff was unsteady when they crossed the inlet through the barrier islands. Bantry's seawall protected the houses, and the commercial fishing fleet needed the inlet to shuttle between the sea and Bantry's processing plant. "I wasn't afraid at the time," Daniel said, opening his eyes. "Now every time I think about that eel's fangs, they get another inch longer." "They were bloody long enough in all truth," Hogg said. "I don't guess you could see them, but I bloody could." "I didn't get a good look till you put a spike through his brain," Daniel agreed. "That was a nice thrust." "Nice as I ever made," Hogg said, but he sounded desperate and angry rather than deservedly triumphant. I wasn't bloody sure I could do it. I was sure, Daniel said, which was the truth, but he'd have said it anyway. Hogg had been afraid because he had nothing to do but wait while death wriggled toward the young master. Daniel had been busy trying to splash backward with one hand and to guess where the skiff was and where the eel was, while all the time planning how to get himself into the boat, while holding the lure in the water with his left hand till the last instant. He hadn't had time to worry about dying, though if asked he would have said it was probable. Wolf eels weren't exactly poisonous, but their fangs were so septic with decaying flesh that the chance of surviving a bite was negligible. Daniel looked up at the seawall as they puttered toward the little harbor, a niche behind a breakwater where a small craft could be dragged out of the water. He had thought that Miranda might be waiting up there for him, but the only greeting was a chorus of, "Hey, Squire!" from Hebney, Colfax, and Riddle, who spent most of their time on the seawall drinking ale. 2 of them were crippled, and all 3 were old. They weren't so much idlers as past the ability to work. Miranda hadn't known when he would be back after all, and she couldn't have expected an ordinary afternoon's fishing to lead to, well, what it had. Hogg nosed them into the little harbor. "Daniel!" Miranda cried, springing up from a concrete bench cast into the breakwater. She had been on the dock, not up on the seawall. "Oh, darling, I'm so glad to see you." "Got it?" said Hogg, grabbing a bit to steady the skiff. He waited to tie up until Daniel had stepped out. Daniel hugged his fiancée. He was a little embarrassed to have thought that Miranda hadn't come to greet him, and more than a little worried because her greeting was so enthusiastic. Did she know? "Daniel," Miranda said, stepping back slightly. "I invited Tom Sand to dinner tonight. If I did wrong, I apologize, but it sounded important, and I didn't know when you would be getting back." "Of course it's all right," Daniel said heartily as he wondered what was going on. "I'd better get cleaned up. I went swimming to free the lure the last time." Which was enough to say about the fishing trip, he decided. Miranda knew his work was dangerous, but there was no need to tell her how dangerous bad luck could make his leisure. He gestured her ahead of him to the cast staircase. The steps were slippery, so that put him in a position to catch her if she fell. A vanishingly improbable event, but a reflexive matter of courtesy. "That's, the builder, you mean?" he added. "Ah. And he's coming for me, not Adele?" The only Tom Sand Daniel knew was the major contractor who, as a favor, though Daniel wasn't sure who the favor had been to exactly, had built the community building which Daniel had given to Bantry. Daniel had gotten on well with Sand the few times they'd met, but they were barely social acquaintances. Sand was also the husband of Bernice Sand. Daniel knew as little as possible about Adele's intelligence work, but he couldn't help making that connection when heard the name. "Yes," Miranda said, pausing for Daniel at the top of the seawall. "I told him you were out fishing, so I don't think he could have thought I meant Lady Mundy." "Another woman would have told me that I was treating her as though she were a moron," Daniel said. "You are far too sweet to say that, even if it's true, for which I apologize." He grinned and kissed her. A pair of housewives chatting on one's doorway giggled, and a man, one of the trio on the seawall, cackled, "Give her another one, Squire! She's too pretty to stop there!" Miranda was tall and fair, attractive by any standard. She wasn't beautiful at a glance, but even on first meeting, she had projected an aliveness that set her apart from the conventionally lovely girls whom Daniel had dated to that moment. Daniel waved to the idlers but avoided eye contact. He was the squire whenever he visited Bantry, in fact, though not by law. He had the respect of everyone on the estate and their due deference also. But a free citizen's deference didn't mean slavish kowtowing. Though Daniel was first among equals, the folk he'd grown up with were his equals as men and women. "It was a little awkward," Miranda said in a low voice as they walked toward the manor house. "Cloris, the housekeeper, Widow Green, took the call and told me that Master Sand was calling for the squire. I picked up the phone and said that you were fishing, but that I'd have you call back as soon as you got in. And I called him Tom because, of course, we've been introduced." "Right," said Daniel, nodding. He hadn't seen the problem yet, but he knew there had to be one for Miranda to be agitated. "He hadn't planned to tell anyone but you that it was him calling," Miranda said. Cloris recognized his voice, and I didn't realize that he hadn't identified himself. He was surprised when I called him Tom. Daniel laughed. "Cloris has an ear for voices," he said. "I doubt she's heard Tom Sand speak more than half a dozen times in all her life, and that just a few words each. I certainly wasn't expecting to hear from him." He looked sharply at Miranda as they reached the veranda. "Did he say what it was about?" "He asked to come to dinner," Miranda said, entering as Daniel held the door for her. "He said his wife wouldn't be along. I told him that he was welcome and that if he liked, I'd leave Bantry." She paused in the front room. The rambling old building was being spruced up now that Daniel was spending time at Bantry again, but the air held a cutting hint of the bleach which was being used on the mold. "He said he wouldn't think of putting me out, but that yes, he'd appreciate privacy with you during dinner," she continued, holding Daniel's eyes. "I know it wasn't my place to invite him, but he sounded so worried, and I didn't know how to get to you." Daniel took her hands. Miranda was as concerned as he'd ever seen her, afraid that she had interfered in his business. Throughout their relationship, she pointedly had tried at all costs to avoid that. "Thank you, dear," he said. "You did right. You had to make a decision, and you chose the better of two options. Either was acceptable, and anyway, I wouldn't be upset if you'd guessed wrong." "So it's 3 for dinner, Mirandy?" Mistress Green said, calling across the front room. Daniel and Miranda were still in the entrance hall with old paddles, fishing poles, and yard tools, some of them broken. "2, Cloris," Miranda said, looking over her shoulder with a bright smile. "I'm going to check with Gwen Higginson," wife of the head of the fish processing plant, "to see if they've got room at table for me while the men talk business here." Mistress Green snorted. "If she didn't, she'd put her husband out in the shed to make room," she said correctly enough. "Cloris," Daniel said, "Hogg and I caught some sprats. Tom Sand and I will have those, but I've got to shower. That car of his will make it from Xenos in 2 hours if he pushes it." "I've laid clean clothes on the bed," Miranda said. She caught concern in the slight tenseness at the corners of Daniel's mouth. "No, nothing fancy," she protested. "Just like what you're wearing. RCN Utilities, only clean. And a newish pair, one that you haven't split up the seat." Laughing as though he hadn't momentarily feared that he would find his dress whites waiting for him in the bedroom, Daniel walked through the front room on his way to the showers at the back. Miranda stayed beside him. "I tried to think what Adele would do." She grinned, but the expression had a wry tinge. "That didn't help much," she said, "because I realized Adele wouldn't be out of contact." Daniel laughed in real humor as he bent to take off his soft boots. A pair of shower shoes waited just inside the door of the large tile room. He was very lucky to have met Miranda Dorst. Sorry, though, he was that the occasion of meeting had been the death of her brother under Daniel's command. "Adele isn't a magician, love," he said as he stripped off the utilities he'd worn fishing. The fabric dried quickly, but the many pockets were damp and probably held weed and mud. "I grant that she seems to be one sometimes." Daniel turned on one of the 3 shower heads. Instead of a drain, the runoff slanted down the floor and through the gap under the outer wall. One good thing about this Tom Sand business was that Daniel was no longer thinking about the wolf eel and what hadn't quite happened. He grinned. "Instead, I can worry about what Mistress Sand's husband needs to tell me in secret, and what that means for me and Adele."
That was another segment in our complete audiobook serialization of David Drake's The Sea Without a Shore. And that's it for the podcast. Thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And rolling thunderclouds filled with a variety of fireworks and seasoned with an aerosol of 15 pepper sauces, and scattered boxes of Light Anywhere matches that contain their own oxygen supply, and even work in space. And the thanks and praise of a grateful readership to David Afsharirad, Brendan Dubois, Andrea M. Pauley, Claudine Griggs, Seth Dickinson, Brian Dolton, and Hank Davis. editor and authors of the year's best military and adventure SF 2015. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.